Imagine this. You're driving down a lonely country road on a freezing December night. The windows are fogged just slightly, the engine hums, and the silence outside feels almost alive. Suddenly, headlights appear in your mirror. The car slows, pulls up beside you, and before you can react, gunshots explode in the darkness. That terrifying moment wasn't fiction, it was real. And it marked the beginning of one of the most chilling mysteries in American history, the case of the Zodiac killer. Because December 20th, 1968, 17-year-old David Faraday and 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen were out on their very first date. They borrowed David's mother's Rambler station wagon and drove to Lake Herman Road, a quiet stretch of countryside that local teens often use as a place to park. They were young, excited, probably nervous, and completely unaware that someone was watching them. At some point after 10 p.m., another car pulled up. The headlights cut across the field, slowing, pausing. Then the car parked alongside them. A man stepped out, approached the Rambler, and without warning began firing. David was shot at close range, killed instantly. Betty Lee bolted from the car, running for her life into the cold night, but bullets tore through her back. She collapsed just 28 feet from the vehicle. Two teenagers, full of promise, were gone in seconds. The police were baffled. There was no robbery, no assault, no motive that made sense. Just two kids dead on a country road, murdered by a ghost who left nothing behind. Investigators were left with only questions. Who could do something like this? Why? And was it a one-time act of violence? Or the start of something far worse? The answer came 7 months later, on July 4th, 1969. Fireworks lit up the sky across Hollywood. 22-year-old Darlene Ferrand and 19-year-old Michael Hill drove to Blue Rock Springs, just a few miles from where David and Betty had been murdered. They parked, talking, relaxing, until the sudden happens. That night, just before midnight, another car pulled up beside them. For a moment it moved away, then returned. The driver stepped out, shining his flashlight into their car, and Betty's back. Bullets ripped through the window. Breathlessly, smoke filled the exploding car, but somehow clung to life. Darlene wasn't so lucky. She was struck again, and within minutes she was gone. And then came the call. In the early hours of July 5th, the Vallejo Police Department's phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm, flat, deliberate. The caller claimed responsibility for the Blue Rock Springs attack and for the murders on Lake Herman Road. He described details only the killer could know, then hung up. Just like that, the faceless phantom who had struck twice had given himself a voice. But he wasn't finished. Later that same month, newspapers across the area received letters, neatly printed in block letters. The messages demanded that the editors publish them on the front page or more people would die. Enclosed with the letters was a bizarre cipher, a coded message filled with strange symbols, circles, and crosses. It was a taunt, a puzzle, and a threat all at once. For days, law enforcement and amateur code breakers struggled to solve it. Finally, a school teacher and his wife, Ronald and Betty Harden, cracked the cipher. The solution was shocking. It didn't reveal his name, but instead his twisted beliefs. He wrote, I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all. He ended with a chilling line, I will not give you my name because you will trap me. Slow down or stop my collecting of slaves for the afterlife. It was a manifesto of madness. Not only did it prove that the killer was still believing, but it showed he wanted attention. He wasn't hiding in the shadows, he was kidnapping to be killed. He wanted to be real. But ordinary was worth counting. Ordinary people didn't knock on doors, but they were lucky signs someone was paying attention to them. He now had a name, Zodiac. His letters were signed with a strange symbol, a circle with a cross through it that quickly became as infamous as his crimes. And this was just the beginning. By the summer of 1969, Zodiac had claimed multiple lives, taunted police with phone calls and letters, and set himself up as a puzzle master, daring the world to catch him. Each step, each letter, each murder was a rehook into his twisted game. He wasn't just killing, he was performing. The question hanging over everyone was simple. Who was he, and how many more would have to die before he was caught? And that's where the trail leads us next. because the Zodiac killer was far from finished. No letters, no victims, no clothes with fear. The killers would grow bolder, the messages stranger, and the fear more suffocating. He would turn the entire Bay Area into his stage. This was only the opening act of his reign of terror. By the late summer of 1969, fear was spreading across Northern California. People were locking their doors earlier, looking over their shoulders, and wondering if the man who called himself Zodiac might be watching them next. His first cipher had been cracked, but instead of revealing his identity, it revealed something worse: his obsession with killing, his thrill in playing games with the press, and his hunger for control. But the Bay Area hadn't seen the last of him. In fact, the Zodiac was only just beginning to raise the stakes. On the evening of September 27, 1969, two college students, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, were relaxing by the shore of Lake Berryessa, about 30 miles from Napa. The lake was calm, the hills golden with late summer grass, and the two were enjoying a quiet afternoon picnic. They had no idea that a man had been watching them from a distance. As the sun dipped lower, Brian and Cecilia noticed a figure approaching. At first glance, he didn't seem threatening, but as he drew closer, they realized something was very wrong. The man wore a black hood that covered his entire head, with clip-on sunglasses over the eye holes. Around his chest hung a strange symbol, hand-stitched in white, a circle with a cross through it, the mark of the Zodiac. In his hands was a gun. The stranger spoke calmly, claiming he was an escaped convict from a prison in Montana, that he needed their car and money to flee to Mexico. His voice was steady, almost rehearsed. Brian and Cecilia, terrified, listened as he ordered Cecilia to tie Brian's wrists with pre-cut lengths of plastic clothesline. Then he tied Cecilia's hands himself, but it was never about robbery. Suddenly, the man pulled out a long knife and attacked. Cecilia was stabbed 10 times. Brian was stabbed 6. Both collapsed, bleeding in the dirt, fighting to stay alive. After the attack, the hooded man walked calmly to Brian's Volkswagen, pulled out a marker, and wrote across the car door. He drew his crosshair symbol, listed the dates of his previous murders, and added, Sept 27, 69, 6:30 by knife. It was a signature, a declaration, a sick form of ownership. Hours later, a call came into the Napa County Sheriff's Office. The voice was calm, deliberate, and familiar. "I want to report a murder," the caller said. He described the attack at Lake Berryessa, gave directions to the scene, and then ended with chilling words. "I'm the one who did it." The call came from a payphone just blocks away from the sheriff's office. The Zodiac had been close enough to hear the sirens. When police arrived at the lake, Cecilia was still alive, whispering details about the attack. She described the hood, the symbol, the way he spoke. Brian, despite his injuries, also survived, but Cecilia's wounds were too severe. She slipped into a coma and died 2 days later. The attack at Lake Berryessa was unlike anything the Zodiac had done before. For the first time, he appeared in costume, almost theatrical, presenting himself as a character straight from a nightmare, and more disturbingly, he was growing bolder. He wanted his victims to see him, to remember him, to carry his mark even in their final moments. But just 2 weeks later, on October 11, 1969, he would strike again, and this time in the very heart of San Francisco. That night, cab driver Paul Stein picked up a passenger near Union Square. The fare was supposed to be a simple ride to Presidio Heights, but when the taxi reached the destination, the passenger pulled out a gun and shot Stein in the head. He then calmly wiped down the car, tore a piece of Stein's bloody shirt, and vanished into the dark streets. At least 3 teenagers watching from a nearby window saw the killer in action. They described him as a heavy-set white male, 35 to 45 years old, with glasses. Police patrols were rushed to the scene, but in one of the most infamous blunders in the case, the suspect was mistakenly described as a black male over the radio. Officers actually stopped a man who matched the real description walking away from the crime scene but let him go. The Zodiac had slipped through their fingers. And then, as always, came the letter. Days later, the San Francisco Chronicle received an envelope. Inside was a letter mocking police, along with a blood-stained piece of Paul Stein's shirt as proof. The message was clear. He was taunting them, daring them to catch him, ridiculing their failure. The Bay Area erupted in panic. It was one thing for a killer to target teenagers in secluded places. It was another to kill a man in the middle of San Francisco and then brag about it. Schools were told to take precautions. Parents kept their children indoors. The Zodiac wasn't just a killer anymore, he was a terrorist, using fear as his weapon. In his letters, he threatened to attack school buses, promising to shoot out the front tire and then pick off the kiddies as they came bouncing out. The image was so horrifying that bus routes were changed, police escorts were added, and children sat nervously on their way to school. The Zodiac had the entire city in his grip, but behind the fear was something even more chilling, his sense of pride. He wanted to be seen, to be heard, to be remembered. He wasn't just killing, he was performing, and every murder, every phone call, every letter was part of his show, and the public, terrified though they were, couldn't look away. Newspapers sold more copies. People whispered his name in diners and bars. Amateur sleuths pored over his ciphers, convinced they could be the one to solve the puzzle and unmask him. The Zodiac had turned Northern California into his stage. The dawn of 1970 should have felt like a fresh start, but in Northern California, the new decade arrived under a shadow. The Zodiac had already claimed lives, sent codes, and terrorized the public with his threats. His letters were appearing regularly in the San Francisco Chronicle, and each one seemed more bizarre, more arrogant, and more sinister than the last. January brought yet another letter. Once again, it was handwritten in the killer's now familiar Blackie style. This time he demanded something strange. He wanted his symbol, the circle with a cross through it, to be worn by the people of San Francisco. He insisted his emblem should be displayed prominently, as if he was a king marking his territory. The tone wasn't just threatening, it was commanding, as though he believed he had earned the right to rule through fear. The police were exhausted. They had suspects, leads, interviews piling up by the day. But every time they thought they were close, the trail went cold. The killer seemed untouchable, protected by the chaos he created, and then came the ciphers. One of the most infamous was sent in April of that year. Known today as the 13-character cipher, it was short, puzzling, and unlike his earlier codes, it was never solved. The Zodiac claimed it contained his name, but it was likely another game, another way to keep investigators spinning in circles. And while police struggled, he grew bolder. In one chilling letter, he described in detail how he was constructing a bomber death machine, as he called it. He explained the mechanics, described the explosive, and promised that he would use it on a school bus if people didn't pay attention. For parents, the thought was unbearable. The idea of a faceless killer targeting children turned daily life into a nightmare. Every school morning felt like a gamble, but the Zodiac didn't stop at bombs. He started dropping hints that his list of victims was growing. In some letters, he included numbers, claiming they represented how many people he had killed so far. Sometimes the total matched known victims, sometimes it was much higher. Was he exaggerating? Or was he confessing to crimes no one had connected yet? No one could be sure. And then there were the phone calls. Police dispatchers and even private citizens reported strange calls, sometimes hang-ups, sometimes cryptic words spoken in a low voice. People began to wonder how many of those calls were really the Zodiac. How many times had he slipped past unnoticed, blending into the crowd like an ordinary man? By spring, his reputation was legendary. He wasn't just a killer anymore, he was a cultural figure, a phantom everyone recognized but no one could catch. Films, books, even local comedians mentioned him. He had wormed his way into the public consciousness, and he loved it. The more attention he got, the stronger he seemed to become. But behind the letters and threats, police were still chasing real leads. One suspect in particular began drawing their attention, a man who lived near Vallejo, who matched witness descriptions, and who had an odd obsession with codes and ciphers. His name was Arthur Lee Allen. Investigators questioned him, searched his home, even compared his handwriting, but nothing definitive tied him to the murders. Suspicion grew, then faded, then grew again. Allen would remain a central figure in the case for decades, but in 1970, police had no proof. As summer arrived, the Zodiac struck again, not with bullets this time, but with more letters. He taunted that the police could not protect anyone. He ridiculed detectives who had dared to speak publicly about him, And always at the bottom of each letter, that same mark, the circle with the cross. Every communication was another hook. People who read the Chronicle at breakfast weren't just looking for the news, they were checking if the Zodiac had spoken again. Each word kept the Bay Area in suspense, every letter a new performance in his theater of fear. The year ended much as it began, with more questions than answers, more threats than evidence, and a public trapped in the Zodiac's game. He had shown that he didn't need to kill constantly to stay powerful. All he had to do was write, taunt, and threaten, and the whole world would listen. But 1971 would bring new twists, letters claiming he had killed far more than anyone suspected, and strange connections to cases outside California. The mystery was deepening, and the Zodiac wasn't finished yet. By the time 1971 arrived, California had lived under the shadow of the Zodiac for more than 2 years. The attacks, the phone calls, the bloody souvenirs, and above all, the letters, those mocking, taunting letters had carved fear into the daily lives of millions. It wasn't just the killings anymore. It was the uncertainty. Every new message from him brought fresh panic, and every silence felt like waiting for a storm that might strike at any moment. The Zodiac had promised that he was building a bomb. He called it his death machine, and he described it in chilling detail. A metal case filled with explosives designed to be detonated remotely, powerful enough to rip apart a school bus. He even sent diagrams of how it would work, almost like an engineer proud of his design. In his letters, he threatened that unless his words were printed, unless he received the attention he demanded, he would use it. For parents, it was terror beyond imagination. Each school morning was a ritual of fear, watching their children climb aboard buses, not knowing if the faceless man with the crosshair symbol might be waiting down the road. Police escorted buses, officers followed routes, but the fear never went away. The Zodiac wasn't just threatening lives. He was holding an entire region hostage, and the letters kept coming. Some were long, rambling, filled with insights for the police. Others were shorter, clipped, but always signed with his trademark crosshair. Sometimes he included more ciphers, daring the world to solve them. One letter, sent in March of 1971, included a new tally of his victims. He claimed that he had killed 37 people, 37, but authorities could only confirm a fraction. Of that number, was he lying to inflate his legend? Or was he confessing to murders no one had connected yet? That question would haunt investigators for years. The strange thing was, the longer the Zodiac wrote, the more it became clear that he craved recognition more than anything else. He wrote about how much he enjoyed watching people panic. He claimed credit for crimes no one was sure he committed. He even suggested he was watching detectives as they worked, laughing at their failures. To him, the fear was as satisfying as the murders. Police departments across Northern California, Vallejo, San Francisco, Napa, and beyond were overwhelmed. Detectives traded theories, suspects, and scraps of evidence, but the killer's identity remained hidden. Handwriting analysis gave them leads, but none strong enough for an arrest. Suspects were questioned, investigated, then released. Every time the press printed a new letter, the public looked for answers in the handwriting, in the strange phrases, in the ciphers that seemed to taunt from the page. One cipher from 1970 still hadn't been solved, and in 1971, investigators admitted they weren't even sure it could be. Unlike the earlier code, which had revealed his twisted philosophy, this one seemed different, shorter, harder, maybe deliberately unsolvable. It was another layer of mystery in a case already drowning in it. And yet, despite the letters, despite the threats, something began to change in 1971. The Zodiac's murders slowed down, at least the murders we could confidently link to him. For the first time, the violence took a backseat to his words. The killings that had shocked the Bay Area in 1968 and 1969 weren't repeating with the same intensity. Instead, he was writing more, threatening more, boasting more. He had become a phantom performer who thrived on fear itself. But that didn't make the danger feel any less real. The bus bomb was always in the back of people's minds. The fear that one morning his threats might finally become action. The mystery of the 37 victims he claimed, the constant sense that he could strike again at any time, anywhere. By the end of 1971, investigators were exhausted. They had chased thousands of leads, interviewed countless suspects, even tailed men who seemed to match descriptions, but nothing held. The killer was still a shadow. His words still appeared in the chronicle, and his true name, remained hidden. The Zodiac had done something few criminals ever managed. He had created a myth around himself. He was no longer just a murderer. He was an idea, a faceless, nameless threat that lived in every whispered rumor, every cipher unsolved, every headline that carried his mark. And as the years pressed forward, the question grew louder. Had he disappeared? Had he stopped killing? Or was he still out there, laughing at everyone who tried to catch him? 1972 would bring new silence, but silence from the Zodiac was never a comfort. It was a pause, a shadow lingering at the edge of vision, because if he had taught the world anything, it was this. When you least expected him, he would speak again. By 1972, something strange had happened in Northern California. The letters that once arrived like clockwork had slowed. The phone calls had stopped. The newspapers, once filled with taunts and cryptic codes, were quieter. For the first time in years, the Zodiac killer seemed to fade into the background. But silence, when it came from the Zodiac, was never reassuring. It was unsettling, like the stillness before a storm. For detectives, the question was maddening. Had he really stopped killing, or had he simply stopped writing about it? Was the ego-driven showman gone, or was he killing quietly now, leaving bodies that no one connected to him? In his last confirmed letter of 1971, the Zodiac claimed he had killed 37 people, but investigators could only tie him to 7 victims, 5 dead, 2 survivors. The gap between what he bragged about and what could be proven left a hole that was impossible to fill. If he was telling the truth, then dozens of unsolved murders across California might carry his shadow. If he was lying, then it was just another part of his game. Either way, police didn't know. The early 1970s brought new theories, new suspects, and new doubts. Some investigators believed the Zodiac had been arrested for another crime, locked away without anyone realizing who he really was. Others thought he had died or moved away, taking his darkness with him. And yet, every time a violent crime made headlines in California, someone whispered, "Could this be him?" The pressure on police was immense. The Vallejo, Napa, and San Francisco departments were still chasing leads, still trying to untangle the letters and ciphers. The FBI kept files open, but without fresh evidence. Even federal agents felt the case slipping into cold territory. And in the absence of certainty, the public imagination filled the void. Amateur sleuths sprang up everywhere. Ordinary people, convinced they could crack the codes or find the man behind the crosshair. Teachers, hobbyists, even children pored over the ciphers published in the newspapers, hoping to be the one who unlocked the killer's secret identity. It was unlike anything law enforcement had ever seen, a murder case that had turned into a puzzle for the entire community. And then, in 1973, whispers began again. Letters arrived that some believed were from the Zodiac, though their authenticity was debated. Some were crude imitations, likely sent by pranksters desperate to insert themselves into the legend. Others felt too close, too accurate to dismiss so easily. But without proof, the case sank deeper into uncertainty. The truth was, the Zodiac had already achieved something horrifying. He had become a ghost. His crimes weren't just in the past, they lingered in the present, haunting every parent who sent their child to school, every couple who parked on a quiet road, every cab driver who picked up a stranger. Even in his absence, he was still there. And when 1974 came, the silence broke. New letters arrived, written in the same blocky handwriting, signed with the same symbol. But this time, the tone was different. Instead of ciphers and threats, the Zodiac seemed to be mocking pop culture itself. He sent a note praising a violent movie, calling it entertaining. He called out critics by name, as if he had traded his role as a killer for that of a commentator. It was bizarre, unsettling, and yet familiar. The man who once promised to blow up a school bus was now reviewing films. Had the Zodiac grown bored of killing? Or was this simply another mask, another way to taunt the world? For police, it didn't matter. The fact that he was writing again meant the case wasn't dead. The killer was still alive, still watching, still choosing when to remind everyone he existed. And if he was still out there, then he could strike again at any moment. The early 1970s left more questions than answers. Had the Zodiac really stopped? Or had he slipped into the shadows, killing quietly under new names and new circumstances? His threats had changed, his letters had shifted, but his symbols still carried the same weight. A circle, a cross, a reminder that the most dangerous monster of all is the one you cannot see, the one you cannot catch. The world was changing, the decade was moving forward, but the Zodiac was not done yet. His next letters would be stranger still, letters that left detectives wondering if the man who had terrified California was losing his grip or simply playing a deeper, darker game. In 1974, the Zodiac killer's voice returned, but it wasn't quite the same as before. After months of silence, the San Francisco Chronicle once again received a letter. It was short, written in the familiar blocky handwriting, and signed with the crosshair. But instead of boasting about murders or ciphers, this one was different. It began with a chilling declaration. I saw and think The Exorcist is the best satirical comedy that I have ever seen. The Exorcist had just been released, and audiences across America were terrified by its shocking portrayal of demonic possession. But the Zodiac wasn't scared, he was amused. He mocked the film as if it were nothing more than a joke. And at the bottom of the letter, he added a cryptic symbol and a quote that seemed to reference an obscure play, leaving investigators baffled about its meaning. This was the Exorcist letter, and it marked a strange new chapter in the Zodiac's communications. The killer who once described building bombs and collecting slaves for the afterlife was now reviewing movies. But beneath the odd humor, the letter carried the same menace. Proof that he was still out there, still alive, still choosing when to make his presence known. The Exorcist letter wasn't the last, more notes followed, though their authenticity was often questioned. Some were long rants about society, others seemed to parody newspaper columnists. In one, the Zodiac threatened again to kill, but investigators were divided. Was this truly the Zodiac, or were copycats taking advantage of the legend he had created? For the police, the frustration was unbearable. By now, thousands of suspects had been questioned. Handwriting experts compared samples, psychiatrists tried to profile him, and still he remained a ghost. His letters were the only solid connection, but even those were starting to feel different, less direct, less tied to murders, more like the ramblings of a man who had grown addicted to attention. But the question remained, had he stopped killing, or had he simply stopped confessing? California in the mid-1970s was still rife with violent crime. Unsolved murders dotted the map. Some investigators believed Zodiac's hand was hidden in many of them. Others argued that his true body count was far smaller than he claimed. Meanwhile, the public had changed. In 1969, his letters had created widespread panic. By 1974, the fear was still there, but so was fatigue. People had grown used to his threats. He had become part of the backdrop of California crime, a nightmare everyone knew, but no one could escape. And yet, every time one of his letters appeared, old fears rushed back. Parents remembered the bus bomb. Survivors remembered his voice, his gun, his knife. Detectives remembered the mistakes that had let him slip away. What made the Exorcist letter especially haunting was what came after. In it, the Zodiac hinted that the tally of his victims had grown again. He wrote the number 37 once more, claiming a total far beyond what police could confirm. But he offered no details, no names, no bodies. It was a number written in blood on the walls of the case, leaving investigators with the same endless question: was he telling the truth? As the years wore on, more letters trickled in. Some mentioned famous people, some mocked political figures. Others seemed so strange, so disconnected from his earlier style, that detectives wondered if they were even authentic. But the handwriting, the crosshair, the tone, it was always close enough to keep the debate alive. And with every disputed letter, the Zodiac's mystery grew larger. He wasn't just a killer anymore. He was a puzzle, a legend, an enigma that refused to be solved. By the late 1970s, the trail was colder than ever. No new confirmed murders, no arrests, no solid suspects, just letters, rumors, and the memory of a man who had once terrorized California. But the Zodiac wasn't done haunting. Even in silence, his presence loomed. Investigators knew one thing for certain. If he was alive, he could strike again, and if he was dead, then the secret of his identity was buried with him. Either way, the story of the Zodiac killer was far from over. For years, the Zodiac was little more than a shadow and unknown figure hiding behind ciphers, letters, and taunts. Police chased thousands of leads, but one name rose above the rest, a man who would become the prime suspect in the case. His name was Arthur Lee Allen. Allen was a former schoolteacher from Vallejo, a large man with a reputation that unsettled many who knew him. In the late 1960s, he had been fired from his job for inappropriate behavior around children. He lived alone, collected weapons, and had an unusual interest in cryptography. On the surface, he seemed like an ordinary man struggling through life, but to investigators, the details were too close to ignore. Friends and acquaintances told police disturbing things. They claimed Allen had once spoken about wanting to kill couples at lovers' lanes. He supposedly bragged that the police would never catch him. He even joked about calling himself Zodiac before the letters appeared in the newspapers. It was enough to make detectives' hair stand on end. When police questioned him in 1971, Allen admitted some strange facts. He wore a Zodiac brand wristwatch, complete with the circle and cross symbol that matched the killer's signature. He had a fascination with ciphers. He owned the same kind of boots that had left tracks at one of the murder scenes, and his birthday matched one of the dates hidden in the Zodiac's cryptic messages. It felt like too much to be coincidence. But coincidences are not convictions. Despite the suspicion, hard evidence was missing. Handwriting experts compared Allen's script to the Zodiac letters and declared it did not match. His fingerprints didn't match those lifted from crime scenes. His DNA, when later tested against saliva on Zodiac stamps, also failed to confirm him as the killer. Time and again, the circumstantial evidence built up, and time and again, it fell apart. Still, Allen remained the prime suspect. Detectives kept circling back to him. In 1972, his home was searched, but no weapons, no ciphers, no damning evidence was found. In 1974, he was arrested on unrelated charges of child molestation, and he spent time in prison. Some investigators speculated that this explained the Zodiac's periods of silence when Allen was behind bars. The letters stopped, but again, there was no proof. Throughout the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Allen lived under a cloud of suspicion. Amateur sleuths, journalists, even some detectives became convinced he was the Zodiac. Every new theory seemed to loop back to him. Yet the case remained frustratingly unsolved. In 1991, police obtained a search warrant for Allen's home once more. They found bombs, guns, and tapes about sexual abuse. Disturbing, yes, but still nothing directly linking him to the Zodiac crimes. By then, 2 decades had passed since the murders began. Witnesses had aged, evidence had grown cold, and memories had blurred. Arthur Lee Allen died of a heart attack in 1992, taking with him any secrets he might have held. To many, his death felt like the end of the trail. If he had been the Zodiac, then the case had died with him. If he wasn't, then the real killer was still out there, perhaps living quietly, blending into the world as an ordinary man. The debate over Allen's guilt has never ended. Some investigators remain convinced he was the Zodiac, pointing to the mountain of circumstantial evidence and his disturbing personality. Others insist he was nothing more than an eccentric man who fit the profile too neatly to ignore, but not neatly enough to convict. And that was the tragedy of the Zodiac case. For every lead that seemed solid, something always slipped away. Every clue unraveled, every suspect walked free. The killer remained a ghost. By the 1980s, the case was already turning into legend. Books, films, and documentaries kept the mystery alive. Amateur investigators pored over ciphers and timelines, searching for the one mistake that might reveal the truth. But the years ticked by and the trail grew colder. And yet the story wasn't over. Technology was advancing. Forensic science was changing. DNA, once impossible to use in criminal investigations, was beginning to unlock mysteries long thought unsolvable. And many believed that if the Zodiac had left even the smallest trace on an envelope, a stamp, a letter, then someday, science might finally catch him. But the Zodiac had always thrived on staying one step ahead. and as the decades passed, his legend only grew. By the 1990s, more than 20 years had passed since the Zodiac's last confirmed crime. For many, he had faded into legend, a nightmare from another era. But for detectives and amateur sleuths, the case was far from closed. If anything, it was entering a new chapter. Forensic science was advancing at a pace investigators from the 1960s could never have imagined. DNA testing was now possible. Fingerprints could be digitized, run through massive databases in seconds. Computers could cross-reference details, timelines, and evidence. The question hung heavy in the air. Could the Zodiac finally be caught by the technology of a new age? The first target for analysis was his letters. Dozens of them had been sent to newspapers and police departments. Some smeared with saliva where stamps or envelopes had been sealed. If the killer had licked them himself, then maybe, just maybe, his DNA was still there, waiting to be discovered. In the late 1990s, samples were tested. The results were tantalizing but frustrating. A partial DNA profile was developed from one of the envelopes, but it wasn't complete enough to make a match. Still, it gave investigators hope. For the first time, science was reaching into the Zodiac's shadow, tugging at the edges of his mask. Meanwhile, the suspect list continued to swirl. Even after Arthur Lee Allen's death in 1992, many remained convinced he was the killer. Others turned their attention to new names. Every time DNA ruled someone out, sleuths argued that perhaps the samples had been contaminated or that Zodiac hadn't licked the stamps himself. Doubt clung to every answer like fog on a cold San Francisco night, and then came the rise of the internet. In the early 2000s, online forums and message boards exploded with amateur detectives, all determined to be the one to solve the case. The Zodiac was no longer just a subject for police files, he had become a global puzzle. People from around the world studied his ciphers, compared handwriting samples, and debated suspects. Late into the night, some of the theories bordered on obsession. People accused their neighbors, co-workers, even family members of being the Zodiac. Old yearbook photos were scrutinized. Strange coincidences were treated as revelations. The case had transcended its crimes. It had become a mystery that anyone could try to solve, but no one could close. In 2002, investigators announced that DNA taken from one of the Zodiac letters had been compared to Arthur Lee Allen. The result, no match. For some, it was proof that Allen wasn't the Zodiac after all. For others, it only deepened the puzzle. What if the DNA didn't come from the killer, but from someone else who handled the envelope? The questions piled higher and the answers grew thinner. Yet the allure of the case never faded. Television specials, books, and films kept the story alive. In 2007, director David Fincher's film Zodiac reignited public fascination, introducing a new generation to the terror of the killer who had mocked the police and vanished without a trace. For many viewers, the film wasn't just a movie, it was a reminder that the real man had never been caught and might still be out there. Law enforcement, too, refused to let go. Cold case units revisited the files, hoping that each leap in forensic science might provide the breakthrough they needed. They knew that time was against them. Witnesses were aging, evidence was deteriorating, but the legend of the Zodiac demanded pursuit. And then, in the 2010s, another revolution in DNA technology arrived: genetic genealogy. It was the same method that caught the Golden State Killer in 2018, a case that had gone unsolved for decades. Suddenly, people wondered, could this be the key to unlocking the Zodiac's true identity? But if the Zodiac's identity was hidden in the DNA, it was still a lock waiting for the right key. The partial profiles from his letters weren't strong enough, not yet. The case remained suspended, balanced between what was possible and what was known. By the early 2000s, one truth had become clear: the Zodiac had outlived his era. He had crossed decades, adapted to new times, and transformed from a murderer into a myth. His face was still unknown, his name still secret, and yet his presence lingered, felt in every cipher, every unsolved murder, every cold trail that led nowhere. The 21st century had the tools to catch him, but would they? The answer would bring the story into modern times and stir up more controversy than ever before. Decades had passed, the world had changed, but the Zodiac Killer remained. His shadow stretched across half a century. his crimes still unsolved, his name still unknown. For many, he had become more myth than man, a symbol of mystery itself. But the 2010s brought something the 1960s never had: the power of modern science. The breakthrough came with the Golden State Killer case in 2018. Investigators used a brand new tool called genetic genealogy, a technique that compared DNA from crime scenes against millions of profiles in public ancestry databases. It worked. The Golden State Killer, who had eluded police for decades, was finally unmasked. And instantly, one question burned brighter than all the rest. Could the same method catch the Zodiac? Investigators had already extracted partial DNA from the Zodiac's letters, saliva from a stamp, sweat from the back of an envelope. But the problem was, the samples were small and degraded. A partial profile existed, but it wasn't complete enough for genetic genealogy. At least, not yet. Scientists were getting closer though, and hope surged again that the most notorious mystery of the Bay Area could finally be solved. Meanwhile, the internet was buzzing louder than ever. Online sleuth communities, fueled by forums, YouTube channels, and podcasts, devoted endless hours to the case. Every cipher was dissected, every suspect was debated, and in December 2020, one of the biggest breakthroughs came not from police, but from amateur codebreakers. They solved the infamous 340 character cipher, a puzzle that had haunted investigators since 1969. For decades, it resisted every attempt. Then, using computer programs and sheer determination, an international team cracked it. The solution didn't reveal the Zodiac's name, but it carried the same chilling tone. He mocked the police, denied being afraid of the gas chamber, and promised he had a collection of slaves waiting for him in the afterlife. 50 years later, his voice spoke again. But the most controversial claim came in 2021. A group of independent investigators calling themselves the Casebreakers announced they had solved the Zodiac mystery. They named a man, Gary Francis Post, a former Air Force veteran who had died in 2018. They argued that scars on his forehead matched police sketches, that his name fit hidden anagrams in the ciphers, that people who knew him believed he had confessed. To the public, it felt like closure. Headlines spread around the world. Yet official investigators disagreed. The FBI quickly announced that the case remained open and unsolved. Evidence tying Post to the murders was circumstantial. DNA comparisons had not confirmed it. Just like every suspect before him, Gary Post's name ended in controversy, not certainty. And so the Zodiac remains officially unidentified, officially unsolved, a ghost that still walks in the margins of history. Today, the case lives on in the hands of cold case detectives, forensic scientists, and millions of armchair suites around the world. Each year, technology improves. Each year, the chance of extracting a full DNA profile grows stronger. And each year, the hope lingers that one day, the mask will finally be pulled away. But maybe that is the ultimate power of the Zodiac. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted to be feared. He wanted his name, or at least his symbol, etched into history. And half a century later, he has it. Who was he? A school teacher? A veteran? A stranger living quietly in the suburbs? Perhaps one day we'll know. Perhaps his identity will finally fall to the march of science. Or perhaps the Zodiac will remain what he always wanted to be, an unsolved riddle, a phantom whose greatest weapon was not the gun or the knife, but the fear of never knowing. And maybe that's why the Zodiac Killer endures, not just as a criminal, but as a legend. The man who taunted the world and vanished into the night, leaving behind him questions, calls, and the echo of a voice on the phone saying, "Family," almost tiredly. "I'm the one who did it." If this story has pulled you into the mystery, don't let go now. Subscribe to Down Under Mysteries. Join me as we uncover more chilling tales from the shadows of history, and share this video with anyone who dares to step into the unknown. Your support helps keep these stories alive, and together, maybe we'll find the answers that have eluded us for decades. Because the Zodiac case is not just about the past, it's about the questions we're still asking today.